my name's Benedict for Higher Hertz. This is third and going to be last in this little arc on free, high quality, sort of full purpose reverb units. So in the first, we looked at one of the Dragonfly reverbs as a way of starting to understand reverb a little bit better. Then we looked at Aural River, which is a really nice reverb unit. It does have a little bit of a distinctive sound, but is very malleable, so there's a lot to like about it. And for third, I've left one that I really like the sound of, but is a little bit harder to program because you've got to have a slightly different, deeper understanding of how it works. But when you get there, it does sound really, really lovely, which is Epic Verb, which needs echoes and this, that, and the other. But this isn't about triviality, so there will be no echoes. Sorry, boys and girls. This one is from Variety of Sound, and he has developed quite a few devices which are varying forms of interesting. He builds them partially from his own code and partially using the Synth Maker environment, which is similar to Synthedit, and I used very early on. I think it's called Flowstone now, but he's not fully developing things anymore, and that's one of the limits with a lot of these free reverbs. The developers get to the point where, well, there's no return for them, so they move on and do other things, hopefully bigger and better things. I mean, often people develop these things sort of for themselves and sort of to show off their abilities, and if their abilities are good enough, they might well get themselves hired by a bigger coder. Some of them go off to work for doors that we know and maybe love or love to hate. But nice device. Let's start by having a quick bit of an A-B. Dry. Wet. What I like about this is the smoothness and the naturalness of sound. I'm not going to get into a debate about which is more natural, but somehow this I feel sits very, very nicely in mixes. Some reverbs seem to kind of want to draw attention to themselves, and I'm all for reverb, don't get me wrong, I love reverb. More reverb is always better. There is no real point where you can overdo it. Actually, there is. It's very easy to overdo reverb. But this one somehow seems to fit in and mold itself around. I find some reverbs, or a lot of reverbs, often the popular ones, are very sort of look at me, and they become too dominant, too thick. This kind of feels like it molds itself to what's happening in the mix, which I like better. That comes to a personal preference to some extent. We will go through all of the knobs and buttons. Let's have a quick look at Variety of Sound. They do have their own website, which you can access from up top. This is, as I've already said, free. The website's a little out of date, a little off, a little not very well maintained, and a little bit of a nightmare. Largely, you're going to find that you just go to the download page and get it, but you may even have to refer backwards and forwards to go, oh, is this the thing that I'm really wanting to get, kind of thing. It's just how it is when you're dealing with a product that's no longer supported. But it aims at small rooms and ambience, and you can press the plus 10 seconds and get out to 20 seconds of decay, and it handled that really very, very nicely. And you've got the ability to change the length of sound on high versus low frequency, which is similar to something we saw in Dragonfly. Aural's a little bit different. Exactly how they do the math underneath, I don't know. Maybe they've just got all of their reverb split, like a frequency splitter. Don't rightly know. This seems to almost indicate that may be the case. But documentation is there, but loose in the technical side of how things work. And that doesn't bother me in the sense of usability, but I do, as I always say, like to know how things really operate, and I always feel a little bit gypped when the manufacturer knows how something operates but doesn't want to translate that to the masses in a way in which the masses can understand it, because for those who want to understand it, that helps us to use the device. As I've already said, this one on the surface does feel a little obtuse. So this is the KVR page. Probably best to start at the KVR page because you'll make more sense of it. They do have quite a lot of other things, as I said. Then when you're ready to go, pop over to their site, get the download, install it. There is a manual which is worth reading through, but don't be surprised if it doesn't give you a lot of detail. Let's dig into the device itself. Obviously, here we'll work our way through one side to another in a fairly logical order. We have pre-delay. Actually, I better go through. There is a problem. When you first turn this on, you'll go, I'm kind of not getting any reverb out of it, because for some obtuse reason, this defaults to an incredibly small number. Actually to 0 milliseconds. Therefore, it's outputting nothing, and you'll go, doesn't work. Well, it does, but you've got to raise this to actually have some sort of reverb time. How that's got to be, don't know, but it's not a bug we'll ever see fixed, I don't think. And almost had me rule this out, because we do put a fair amount of focus on beginners, and as a learning device that when you turn it on is actually set to not operate. But nonetheless, so long as you know that, raise your time, and then we will get somewhere. So first thing, pre-delay. So we can delay the whole signal. Everything works in milliseconds, which is nice, and it is quite common. You can have your reverb right there with no extra delay time, but it's quite common to have a little bit of delay time to allow some space between the hit and its reverb coming back. Because remember, reverb is all about an action happens in the room, the sound bounces off the walls, the first things that comes back we refer to as early reflections, kind of self-evident, and then that bounced sound will go back and bounce off other walls and come back to us, and which we refer to as late reverb. So the first bounce or so we'll tend to call early, and that's what feeds the late reverb. So you can move how far that first set of earlies is before it comes back, changes our sense of the size of the room, and also gives a little bit more clarity to the original signal. There's no right or wrong amount. Saying I always set it to X is unwise. I have noticed a current trend towards trying to lock all of your reverb times into BPM. Absolutely do not do this. There may be one situation in which it's good, but chances are it's not yours. The problem with doing this is that it's completely unnatural. Yes, there are times where you may say, yeah, I'm going to want everything to groove with the music. That is really natural and correct. But groove with the music is not about locking things to perfect BPM. It means you're not looking to groove with the music. You're merely looking for something external to make your decisions for you. If you're a professional, like if you're a doctor, do you actually go onto Google and go, hey Google, can you diagnose this patient for me because I'm not really doctor enough to do this? No, a good doctor uses their own understanding. They may confirm information off, well, hopefully not Google, but they don't crowdsource. So as a mix engineer, you should not be crowdsourcing. BPM timing is merely just a sneaky way of crowdsourcing and going, oh, but I'm doing it properly. I'm using the official. And it's like, nah. Because when you're in a room, the room isn't BPM locked. The room is just the result of what the room is and where you stand in the room and how loudly you fart. So all of this should be loosey-goosey. And you use the timings that feel good. Yes, if some kind of musicologist freak with a stopwatch were to check it, they may come back and say, "Oh, you're using this musical timing," but who cares? It's how you set these things, how you feel them, how you create the groove with them, enhance the groove with them, change the groove with them, create the feeling of the space that this piece is happening in that defines you as an artist, as an engineer. So everything in milliseconds is appropriate. Pre-delay, simply moving our whole reverb. Time says how long our echo happens, and yes, we can go into the ridiculous, and it handles it pretty well. We might want different EQ settings if we are so inclined, but it is there, and it behaves. We've now got a switch. It says between reverb and ambience. Now, I don't think this is super well named. While technically correct, ambience is generally taken to be really short reverbs, and in this case it's the early reflections. So it's turning off the late reverb. We're just hearing the early reflections section. So this still operates because that's changing the length of the delay taps, which is great, but we're not getting the late. So if you just want to hear earlies, either because that's all you want to put into your mix, or because you just want to check them before you throw, then your ambience really should read ER or early reflections, but otherwise you can just use it as I want to make it really short, which is your early reflections. Your early reflections are based upon a set of models. Models means that, just like the image I will have popped up on sound bouncing back, that's a model. It says, in this situation, this happens, that happens. So the model is that the first delay tap will have been set here, the next one here, the one after here. How they are spaced, the timings and all of that, how they're put together, that creates the model. Whatever we feed into that will then be affected by the model or the algorithm. Algorithmic reverbs are my favorite because they represent how the world works. They don't sound exactly the same as how the world works, but they represent how the world works far nicer than other potential things. So we can move through, you don't seem to be able to click on these individually, but we can move through the different models. And those models are explained. So a large room size, widely distributed reflections, works best for larger reverbs. So we'll make sure we got plenty of reverb coming through here. So those can be used as a reverb all on their lonesome. Then the plate, a medium-sized room, well, technically it should be based on literally a piece of metal, but they give you a kind of a room sound. With a plate, everything's incredibly even. So if we had 10 milliseconds, 20 milliseconds, 30 milliseconds, that's even. If our taps were 15, 19, 23, that is uneven. There isn't a perfect relationship between them. As they stretch, they're still going to stay a little uneven. And that reflects a real room, whereas a plate tends to be perfect, 10, 20, 30 milliseconds, so to speak, which gives a very nice sound in a wonderfully artificial sort of a way. So with longer reverbs, you do get that thick, fat thing that sounds impressive but gets a little kludgy. It's a very common form that you'll find, and people will have made their rooms and what have you that way. This way, a room, mostly centered and even. So some of the taps are a little irregular, So similar to your plate. Then room 2 has more uneven. So it's more like a hall, as in the idea being an even room would be perfectly cuboid. A hall will tend to be longer on one side. So in other words, some of the taps come back quickly, some of the taps come back later, and you end up with this more uneven mess of taps and sounds. I like that. It gives you a more realistic thing. Reflex. It's got more pronounced reflections, and they say you can use it for a pseudo spring reverb. We might need to. Doesn't sound springy to me. Just use these as different sounds. And then apparently large room size force with some ghostly delays. It does have more noticeable delays and taps in there. No right or wrong as to what you use. For the moment, we'll go with the Hall. I must say I quite like the echo effects, but I've already established I really like fairly sparse, rattly sorts of delays, because then you can build them up layer by layer. But we'll work with the Hall with the reverb in. We'll give it a fair bit of time so we can hear what's going on. Different models. What I like about the different models is they do sound different. They are built on actual algorithms, and because they're different, then you can a little more easily see and correlate than we could with Aural River and their variation thing, and you get a different feel. So you can say, okay, do I want more of that even feel or more of that exciting feel? We've got a little bit of control over our early reflections. This isn't super well annotated. They only pick the first two, fair enough. With my own reverbs, I'm normally sort of giving people control over 4 or 5 of those. And then we are not turning that on again. And then we are able to control the time and the level of them. So we can go from incredibly short and at. Now you'll see that the first one influences the second one. So what that is it within our model, our first one is kind of like pre-delay time. It says, okay, we're going to move that first tap to so many milliseconds. And then the second tap is the length of the first tap plus however many. So at the moment we've got a difference of 1. So if this is set to 12, this is going to be set to 13. If this is set to 12 and 26, then it will move in the same relationship. So they're giving us some control over how these early reflections inside their model happen. And this is what I like about this reverb, is that unlike most reverbs, you've actually got a little bit of different or granular control over how the beginning of that reverb happens. So you can hear that that's sort of smooth and pasty. It's getting looser and rattlier. And much more expansive. You can change the level of these. If you pull them out of the mix, they are still there controlling what's happening to the reverb down the track. You're just not hearing them. So parity means that they're where they should be according to the model, and turning the level up makes them more pronounced. And I like that you can do that, because that's kind of how I like reverbs to be. If anything, I'd almost like a little bit more control. I like to be able to go outside of the ordinary. This has kind of corralled us to somewhere within the realms of the ordinary, which is fair enough in the sense that there is that idea of, oh, we only want to give people practical solutions. Sometimes I like the impractical solutions because they're exactly where I want to be. Once we've got the early reflections set up, we start to get the reverb that we want in terms of size. Then we're looking at damping. So fully bright through to a very damped. Now remember, damping is the equivalent of the amount of fur that we have on our walls. And the furrier our walls, the more stuff like furniture that we have inside our room. And please, not wall padding or hanging blankies around. That is just weird. You make a weird room. That's more for recording, but that's reverb related. People trying to avoid reverb and making weird reverbs. You end up with something like this that you can't get rid of. So just go cautiously, but we can damp as in how much roll off. Now this only has a damp on the highs. There isn't a damp from the lows. Damps from the lows, as I've said, is a little less common on reverbs, which is sort of a shame, but a room is far more likely to damp its highs than it is its lows. So you can set how much you want to damp. Now you can't set where it damps from. Aural River gives you the option to set the frequency around which it damps. This doesn't, but overall the results sort of fairly nice. It's just a knob that works backwards, so no damping to lots of damping makes perfect sense. But if you're thinking in terms of, I want my frequency cut, it works backwards. You just get used to it. But you may find yourself using the knob in the wrong direction for a little while. Brighter, not so bright. So that affects the audibility of your reverb to a fair extent as well, because a lot of the tops go AWOL. Modulation. This is a bit limited in the sense that you only have one knob to control all the modulation. No modulation, and it's very mild. So like Dragonfly, he hasn't given us the option to get into chorusy. That's something that Aural River is nice for. We can get into obviously pronounced chorusing, which we can't hear. It's very subtle movement, aimed more to just stop potential ringing than introduction of chorusing. Swings and roundabouts, the reverb sounds good. If we really want to get into chorusing of the reverb, then I would be adding another device just after this, which is actually chorusing my reverb. And remember, I very rarely have reverbs as inserts. I'm showing it here because it's simply easier to manage and for you to hear the overall. But modulation it's there, but it's limited. It serves the function that it's intended to serve. This is different and interesting. There is the ability to change the relationship between the reverb time, hence RT, of the low versus the high frequency. So, as I said, it gives the impression that maybe he's got some sort of frequency splitter and that the reverb for the high is one process, the reverb for the low is another process. You can fool that just with a kind of EQ on the way in, and you can always de-EQ on the way out or something, but I don't know how it's done. But if he has actually, as what this seems to suggest, a frequency splitter, then there's the ability to turn up the length of the low versus the high. So we can leave the length, which is time here, at 1:1, meaning there's no difference between the two streams against each other. We can shorten it. Meaning we get less bass. Or we can make it a lot longer, meaning that there is more bass. It's not an EQ, apparently, that it's time. So it allows those things to run longer. So if we choose, that should have made the time less. That should have made the time longer. Let's just put... Again, I think is relatively subtle. I wouldn't mind having more power to be able to get into at least the edge of the absurd. Not about, having 3 hours worth of nothing but low end, but I think it would be nice to have a little bit more. But nonetheless, the ability to weight the room is interesting, and in practice, I have liked what I've heard come out of this. It's a little easier to hear a difference here. So you get a stronger sense of a whoop inside the room there. Lightens the room. Even gives it's subtle. You have to learn to hear it if you're not hearing it. But this sets the crossover point at which the signal is divided. We can raise or lower that up to 1.5K. Which really splits our signal in half. It's a nice feature to have. Again, I wouldn't mind the ability to have slightly more dramatic results, but it's there and it does work. And works nicely enough in its own way. We've then got EQ. EQ is a little complex because he's jammed a lot of knobs into a smaller space than entirely... Well, it makes the unit look small and clean and tidy, and I get that. And in a hardware sense, it makes sense. In a software sense, I get it, but I question whether it's the best solution, because you have to come to terms with that there's this part of the knob, the ring, and there's this part of the knob, the center. So if we set our things to default, got that very clear reverb. We've then got our low gain frequency. Sorry, this is our frequency here, and our gain. So our boost and what frequency we're boosting at. There's also this button that changes the Q, or the width of that boost, which is not mentioned in the manual. And to be perfectly honest, I'm not quite sure what it's doing. I think it's narrowing it down. Yeah, I'm pretty sure it's narrowing it down. That would be consistent or normal sort of behavior. Press a button, see what happens. Narrower cues aren't always the wisest, especially when it comes to reverb, because they can make the reverb sound kooky in the mix. But there are times you want to do it for effect. So if we wanted to clear out our reverb a little bit at this point, we could even say, okay, sounds a little nasty at that point, pull it back. If we feel like we've pulled out too much, we can try the narrower Q, in which case it's working quite nicely. You've just got to have an understanding of EQ, of reverb, and how these things feel. And that's the whole idea behind this series, to give ourselves more of an understanding. I just don't want to dig too much into EQ here. There are other programs where we have, and we'll look at that again. But go subtly, try not to just waggle knobs randomly. You want to have a sense of what we're doing here. Same thing, only for the higher end. But we might want to boost something. let's say we want to boost that ever so slightly. So frequency on the outside, cut boost on the inside. 2 EQ points in a bell curve of varying shapes. You then have a high pass and low pass filter. Again, same thing on outside and inside. So high passes in the center, low passes on the outside. Looks like they both use the same metric and they're a full sweep. Unusual. It does make it a little harder to find the bass roll-off, but honestly, not that big of an issue. You just don't have a lot of throw before you're getting up to... We've got our sense of punch there without so much of the murk. We don't want too much treble coming back from that room. Again, just limited range because he's got access to the whole range. It's a can't win sort of a situation. If I were designing it myself in this sort of a form, I would have been tempted to put a range knob to maybe halve the range, to give us a little bit more throw, or maybe even a quarter of the range. So in other words, this would go to maybe 500, whilst this only went down to 5k or something like that. But I would then have had the debate of, do I add 2 buttons? One for the low end, one for the high end. It starts to get more complex. So seeing he's wanted to pare back the number of knobs and buttons, it's not an unreasonable decision. If you're finding that these are too broad a brush, then again, put a device after it to handle your EQs. But we've got nice reverb. It's possibly tubby in the tummy, but it's probably too loud as well. So between in and out, we're getting a clear sense of this happening in a space, which is exactly what we're here to do. The mixing has again this strangely labeled mid-side knob. I'm not a big fan of mid-side. I find it very artificial. What this really means is stereo-ness. So we've got our reverb. We can narrow it down to mono, except I don't think it really is mono, or widen it. I'm not really much of a fan of that because I think it has been done with maybe some kind of mid-side process, which to me always seems really weird, that we sort of split our signal in ways that the real world just kind of doesn't do. So rather than just a narrowing to make it more mono, which the world will do, it's kind of, so it feels a bit weird. Make your own piece as to how you go with that, but it's a kind of a stereo, more or less kind of a knob. Interestingly, there is an out level. Commonly what happens is that as we change our dry-wet balance, then our level out of our plugin changes. You can see here it has dropped a little bit. It's hard to balance because we've moved time, and we've added time, we've added weight in time, therefore our level meters will read differently because our dynamics have changed. Dynamics quite quick because there's little holding each sound, whereas now each sound holds longer so you will read a little differently. but 2 to 3 dB. Will see us give the same sort of result as what we had before. That's a little uncommon in the way that it's done. It's not uncommon to have an art level, but this just somehow feels a little different. Everything about his approach, his variety of sound thing is a little different. You've got to think like him, but it ends up being rather cool. Oh, sorry, I was actually in ambience mode, not in reverb. That explains part of why we're not hearing the big difference here. My bad. Lighter, not as light, and obviously we can pull back our reverb time quite a bit. By the way, I'm not a big fan of that. I would rather see it done a different way. But again, his emphasis has been to try to minimize the number of knobs he's got on board. I would have ended up with something that probably seemed a lot more complex for people, and while it would have had a lot more control, it would have frightened people off. This is close to being frightening enough as it is, I think, so fair enough. But yes, this becomes noticeably a lot more, well, noticeable, because this is affecting the reverb, which is the tail, which is far more what it's about. That's our device. Good and bad is that it does have a nice, thick, in a natural sort of a way sound, rather than a thick in an unnatural sort of a way sound. Generally speaking, I like his models, and I like the fact that we can have a certain amount of control inside his models, because that's where reverb gets exciting. Too many reverb units are, this is the model and you will like it. This is saying, here's a model, you may adjust that. I like that. So the modes are good in that they are different models. I wouldn't mind some more randomly different or wildly different, but again, I keep saying he's bringing this down to be instantly, easily usable for most people. The EQ is a little annoying, but actually works really very nicely once you get in there. The fact that you've got this level of EQ is nice. It's not significantly different on a technical perspective from what's in Oral River, but the way it works is nice. He's got his own feel in how he puts things together. It is, of course, free. The downside of that is that it is a little old. It is overall a little odd, but that's more just in understanding his character and the way he's laid it out, which sadly is not as well explained in the manual as it should be, but it's very rare that developers think in terms of how's the audience going to take this. The technical mindset that makes this kind of developer a coder rarely makes a good manual writer. Modulation is more limited than I would like it to be. A few knobs and buttons have throw that's more limited than I would like, but there are solvable problems with another device. So as I've shown you, put this on a send, put your reverb in, and then send it through a chorus unit on the way out. If your DAW doesn't allow you to do that, chances are you just haven't worked out the features, or maybe get a DAW that does allow you to do these things, because these are really pretty darn important things. The default decay setting, it defaulting to 0 milliseconds, that's almost inexcusable, because when you turn the device on, you've got nothing happening. It's one of those things I would be saying very strongly to the developer, you fix this, but I don't think he's in the game anymore, in which case we just have to work around the fact that every time you launch this, you've got to fix this knob, because it's set to default to 0. It's probably an error in the sense that the device, as he exported it, was set to 0, therefore it's become the default amount. Don't really know what the story is there. It just is what it is. In use, it's a very, very pleasing device, which I have used several times. It's in several tracks. It's actually in a couple of my current tracks on work that I'm working with right now. let's pull this one out and then run through our mix as I have with all of them. So we bring this in. First thing we have to do is give ourselves some time. Looking at our sends. We have signal. But I don't feel like I'm hearing anything. Let's go check. It is there. Ah, it's bypassed, that'll be why. Now we're getting something. So let's design a reverb. I want all my reverb. I will go with his hall, even though the Echo FX is the one that appeals to me the most. But by bringing those early reflections later and higher in the mix, I'm getting the sound that I'm hoping for. Modulation we need plenty of. Getting nice little woofiness in there out of the reverb. Just clear a little bit of that away. Gives us a little bit more snap to our snare. Take the edge off the top end. And this is where the limited throw of the knob becomes difficult, because I've added some bass and I just want to roll off what's underneath that. So I want some of that that we're getting, but I also don't want it to become and we've got limited control here. I'd probably be better with a different EQ, but I'm going to go with what's on board. Again, we'll listen to this thing with the stereo-ness. Reverb out, reverb in. Nice natural sound, as much as I can say within these fellows. Our sends are, of course, on the bus, so our drum and bass is bussed to the bus, and we want that send again to come from the bus, not from the individual tracks. Because if I've done something like, let's say I have, and I haven't done this in other ones, but I'll do it here. Let's say I have compressinated this. Now we can hear a little bit of bite in that compressor. Therefore, that's what's going to the reverb. If we solo this, the reverb is reacting to this. Hear how that reverb now feels a little disconnected from what we're hearing. The reverb carries the punch that we've given with the compression. The reverb is not related to the compression. So not only is this reverb undoing the compression and everything that comes with it, but it doesn't feel like it belongs properly with that sound. So it's come unglued. It's like the sticky tape is no longer sticking that reverb to it because we're generating the reverb from a different sound from what people are hearing. Now, there are some weird-ass times where you will choose to do that to make people feel like, ooh, otherworldly, but I see too often people going, oh, but it's like, no. The idea is that the reverb represents what people are hearing. So now you've got all the advantage of the funky compression that we've done here. And everything tracks and follows and sounds like it should. So always, where you've got buses, send from the bus, not from the individual tracks, or you'll undo your mix and it will sound weird, and you probably won't wonder why, or you probably won't know why. You may not even think it sounds weird because you've decided that this is what you're doing, therefore it's right. You're hearing what you want to hear, and you're more likely, if you are trying to get a compressed sound here, a grooving sound here, you're more likely to overdo it, which means that you've got two layers of weird. One is in overdone groove compression, and the other is that the reverb doesn't represent what people are hearing. And it's these little layers of weirdness, these little bits of weirdness that I hear so often in mixes. And it's not about trying to say thou shalt not. It's just that when I listen to the song, I just think that's uncomfortable. It's not a space I want to be in, because there are all these little things that are like, this is not how the world works. And again, it's not about me saying this is how it has to work, because you hear a vocoder in something like We Are the Robots or Billy Idol's Les Yeux Sans Visage. Actually, no, I'm not sure that is vocoded. I just always think it should be. But where you hear vocoders and things that are super unnatural, they feel natural because they're obeying a paradigm which represents the laws of nature. So don't go breaking the laws of nature unless it's a very deliberate effect and that people are supposed to feel that way. So again, send on our guitars is on the bus. The synth is just a send because there's no bus. I haven't really shown the distinction. I've talked about it, but that allows you to hear the distinction in there. We'll give ourselves a little bit of makeup. Bring our drums back in the mix. And this is one I keep showing. Remember to use delays in your inserts to drive reverb. Notice how when I bring these echoes in, the piece seems bigger. Not only do our instruments sort of separate from each other in depth space, but our reverb overall becomes bigger, glossier, shinier, because it's now taking the results of these echoes and reverbing them as well. So we're carrying our reverb forward in time. So rather than cludging ourselves up with the world's longest reverb, here, our reverb can actually be shorter. Like we might be going out, oh, I need to go this long to get it to sound excellent, whilst our echoes are off, but it starts to get bleh. We're making soup, bad soup. Or we can have a shorter reverb which works well all round, including our drums, and our echoes where we've got them help place our instruments in space and time, helps them stand out from each other, as well as feeding into that reverb. So the things that are meant to sound bigger, the things that don't need to sound bigger, don't need to sound bigger, which means that they sound bigger because there's more sense of definition in space. So you can have a slightly shorter reverb whilst getting a longer total result with those delays. It's an important part of how we set up our space by using these on the insert rather than using them as a send and return, and then you've got this strange echo that doesn't belong anywhere because it's not in the room. people go, oh, but then you bring it back in a channel and you send it to the room. And it's like, yeah, okay, if you've only got one delay unit. But the whole idea of the DAW is that we have an infinite number of delay units, and unless you're using like a Pentium 2 or something truly embarrassing as a computer, then you should have the ability to run a near infinite number of delays. My advice is where you have a delay, use one that will modulate. I know there are plenty of stock units that don't modulate, and they never get opened as far as I'm concerned, because a delay that doesn't modulate will just and kind of die in the mix. There are situations in which you might use them, but not a lot. They were the sorts of delays that we bought back in the late 80s and early 90s because they were affordable. The extra modulation knobs and buttons added a fair difference, and it was hard for us to afford those, but in the studios they all had modulation. So if we were trying to recreate what we were hearing on a Duran Duran or a Gary Newman record, it had modulation in it. We struggled to get there because we couldn't afford the modulation knob, or we were too silly to want to afford the modulation knob because we didn't realize the importance of it. Final words, as a device, I think that its sound and your ability to control the models is what really sets it apart. It does have a nice, smooth, satiny, I don't want to say silky, but it has a nice satiny sort of feel that falls into the mix. It can make it seem a little less audible, but reverb's not there necessarily to stand out. There are a lot of reverbs that are just too fat, too pasty, and it feels like, and it's a thing. If you want exactly that sound, great, then probably choose the plate and make sure everything here is nice and even, maybe even turn down your early reflections and you get that sound. I know it's been used a lot in EDM because they were using these kinds of reverbs and that's how they sound, so everyone got used to that sound, fair enough. But if you're after something that sounds more like real world, without trying to say this sounds exactly like this, because that's just a kooky and absurd thing, it's like, oh look, my performance is in this hall in Siberia. And it's like, no, build the feeling by doing the work in here, and that's what this gives you. Really nice ability to control. Yes, when you actually have the reverb in, this split between low and high does have some real advantage. Hopefully you can notice there that I pushed some of the punch into the reverb, which means that it spreads that punch, and then rolled a little bit off. The EQ is nice. It's a little kooky. You've got to follow his thinking. The mid-side I just stay out of. Again, if you feel like some of his knobs don't have as much throw or as much action as you want, you can just add another device underneath. So in this case, I'd flip my rack and I'd put in a chorus or a different EQ underneath. So it goes send to reverb, reverb to EQ, EQ to return. There's always a way to do that in your DAW somehow. Just don't leap straight away to bringing it back in on a channel. While that feels great, in Reason and several other DAWs, probably you will find that it actually messes up your plug-in delay compensation, and you can start to create some timing or phase issues, because each time that signal goes around, it's a feedback loop, so it's going to deliberately add latency to it so that your thing moves further out every single time. Now, I deliberately do that. Some of my delay units deliberately use that functionality, but it's going to change the sound. If you don't realize that you're doing it, you're not taking it into account. Nice device. Really be aware of that when you turn it on, delay time is set to 0, therefore it's doing nothing. So no matter what you do, you can't hear it because it's doing nothing. Just come to terms with it. All right, conclusion, as I said, to the little reverb arc that we looked at. Dragonfly, which is really interesting and quite useful in certain ways for learning. Aural River, which is a very, very nice all-rounder of reverb, and a little easier to comprehend than the other two. That's why overall I'd sort of say probably the best pickup of the three. If you're going to pick up one, And I would recommend picking up one. If you go, oh, well, they're all great, I'll pick up all three of them. And no, pick up one. Learn it. Learn to get whatever result you're looking for, hell or high water. Also learn to live with the results that you get. Hell and high water, because you'll have both. Because that's part of learning your craft, learning to work what you've got, rather than going, well, that isn't exactly what I want. I have to go get another device till I find the preset I want. It's like you're not learning your craft. So take your time, really do that. Oral River's my recommendation if you're going to pick one and you are in the learning phase. There are great things to gain from looking at Dragonfly, but the Oral River is smoothest all round as a single. If you like the sound of the epic verb, which I do, then there's a lot to recommend. You may just find it a little obtuse until you're really understanding reverb, which Oral River might help you with a little bit better. But if you're saying, no, epic verb's the way I want to go, then toss out all the others, use epic verb, keep spending time playing with it till you go, oh, that is what I would be looking for, or, oh, that was an interesting result. I don't want it right now, but it filed away in memory. Don't save it off as a preset, because when you come to apply that to whatever you want it for next time, it won't actually fit. And then you'll go, that's disappointing. Or you will have said, this must be the right sound because it was the right sound. And then you'll end up with, as I say, a kind of a weird sounding mix because things don't belong together. So just store that idea of, oh, okay, I got that result. It goes into your mental spreadsheet. And then when you redo it, when it does fit, when the idea has value, then you'll find that you're sort of like, oh, okay, now I'm really getting the results. That's how you learn to get your results. So pick your reverb and do everything with it for a long period of time until you feel like you can get whatever you want out of it. Somebody else says, oh, this reverb's better, and you're like, yeah, whatever. Because you're getting to the point where you don't need other things because you're getting the results that you want. Oh, look. It's got a backside. Isn't that cute? And a fuse which does nothing. So it's just there's nothing functional on the backside. It is made in Germany, that's good. Alright, conclusion. End of this series. If you have questions about reverb, about the content, make sure you hit subscribe, please. Sign up, show YouTube that this is valued, because that helps return some value to us. A lot of time and energy and cost goes into making these shows for you. And so therefore you're getting it as such for free. But please remember always, in this business, if you want to have success, you've got to build a backline and you've got to support your backline. And if you're learning through us, then we are right now your backline. If you support us, we're able to support you again further as we move forward. Talk to us, build relationships. I'm amazed how little people actually type in below unless they want to say, you're an idiot because. That's not building a relationship, that's just making yourself out to be, well, somebody nobody wants to have a relationship with. Build relationships, create those things, because out of that is where opportunity comes. I've just done a mix for somebody who I wouldn't have otherwise had access to by just chatting to them, and the opportunity came up. It's like I wanted to do a mix of a rock track. He had a rock track he was happy to have somebody else meddle with. Boom, there we go. I've now got my name on his thing. His thing actually happens to be related to well, he was in a band around the time of Oasis. They didn't get that big, but they got big enough to actually be a known name. This is how we build connections. So talk down below. All right, enough of that. You have a great day. Oh, and I keep forgetting, there is also higherhertz.com, different stream of information from here. Pop across, sign yourself up there as well, and continue to have a great day.